One of my favorite Zen koans is very short and simple. A student asked the master, what's the constant activity of all the bodhisattvas and mahasattvas? Maybe he or she has an idea that enlightened people have some sort of special powers. But anyway, the answer is very much to the point. Responding appropriately. That's what awakened people are doing all the time, moment by moment. Which presumes, of course, that they're aware of the situation in order to know what's an appropriate response. And of course, our practice should help us do that, help us see more clearly what's happening. In the Zendo here, when we're practicing together, an appropriate response is usually not so difficult to figure out, right? The bells ring, and we know that it's time to sit, or another bell rings, it's time to stand up and walk. But what about when we walk out the front door and go out into the world? What's an appropriate response to the kind of situation that we find ourselves in today? An ecological crisis that seems to threaten the future of life on Earth. Before I try to answer that by talking a bit about what Buddhism, Buddhist teachings and practice might have to offer, let me note that I didn't say climate change or even climate emergency, because urgent though that is, that's really just the tip of the iceberg that we're facing today. And I think most of you here are probably already aware of that. When we think of things like the 6th great extinction event, that so many plant and animal species are disappearing right now. I remember E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist, predicted that by the end of this century, up to half of all plant and animal species on Earth, half, could be extinct or so weakened that they'll go extinct soon thereafter. Some people have suggested that rather than call it an extinction event, we might call it an extermination event, because it's not just happening, it's something that we are doing. And there's so many other issues too. I mean, there are so many toxins in the air, in the water, in the earth, in our bodies. Within the last 100 years, about half of all the agricultural topsoil on Earth is washed away. Population, I'm still astonished, revealing my age now. I mean, since I was born, the human population has increased by over 3.5 times. What's going on here? Plastics. Again, when I was born, I think commercial plastics had just started to become available, and now they're everywhere, including in the deepest vents of the ocean. And all of that is without reference to issues of eco-justice or the kind of economic situation we find ourselves in today, this incredible, obscene gap between rich and poor, both in the US and in the world as a whole. And it's increasing, it's still increasing. And let's not get started into politics, right? But when you put it all together, what we're facing, I think, is not just a climate crisis. What we're facing, what we seem to have, is a civilization that seems to have lost its way. And the question is, what does Buddhism, what do Buddhist teachings and practices have to offer that can help us understand and respond appropriately to that? One answer is perhaps nothing. Maybe Buddhism has nothing to offer, in the sense that the kind of challenges we face today weren't those that the Buddha was responding to some 2,400 years ago in Iron Age India, right? I mean, we can look through the Pali Canon and the Mahayana Sutras. There's no direct teachings telling us how to deal with the kind of situation we face today. But the other side of it, of course, is that Buddhism has shown itself to be extraordinarily sort of self-transformative. I mean, from the very beginning, impermanence and insubstantiality have been essential. Radical impermanence, so much so that we can't even say things are changing, but there aren't things. The world isn't a collection of separate things. It's really a confluence of processes. And what's interesting, of course, is those processes include Buddhism itself. Buddhism itself is a classic example of the impermanence and insubstantiality in the way that it has transformed as it's spread from its original birthplace. So everywhere Buddhism has gone, like when it goes into China, for example, it doesn't just impose itself, but there's a kind of creative interaction with what's already there. So our own tradition, which is something that the Buddha never taught in this form, right? Nonetheless, it evolved out of the encounter between Mahayana Buddhism and especially Taoism in China, and then to Japan. So how does Buddhism need to transform today? It seems to me that the ecological crisis, understood in the broadest sense, it's not simply that that is the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced, but it also seems to me it's the greatest challenge that Buddhism has ever faced, right? I mean, how is Buddhism going to respond to a now global civilization, secular, consumerist, but also one that seems to be self-destructing? How must Buddhism transform in order to remain relevant, in order to be most liberative in the face of the situation that we find ourselves in now? And fortunately, it seems to me that although Buddhism isn't going to directly tell us what to do, it seems to me there's lots of things within the Buddhist tradition that we can sort of look at and extrapolate and build upon. And what I'd like to do this morning is pick out one of them in particular, one aspect of Buddhist teachings that really stands out for me, that really seems the most extraordinary and perhaps is the most helpful in the kind of situation that we face now. What I mean is, it seems to me there's this extraordinary parallel between what Buddhism has to say, has always had to say traditionally about our individual predicament, how we understand it or misunderstand it and respond in ways that often make things worse, and how we can actually resolve it. That's the kind of traditional style. An extraordinary parallel between that and our collective situation today in relationship to the biosphere. What do I mean? Well, Thich Nhat Hanh has famously said, we are here to overcome the illusion of our separateness. And traditionally we've understood that in an individual way. The delusion of a separate self inside, separate from other people and the rest of the world outside. But this illusion of separateness, isn't this also the fundamental problem today in terms of our relationship with the earth? That we as a now global civilization, we feel separate from the earth in a way that therefore allows us to sort of exploit it, use it, destroy it in any way we want, because we don't sense that we're a part of it in a way that would involve some kind of sense of responsibility to it. So that's what I want to do. I want to give you a talk in two parts. First of all, giving you my own sort of individual take, my own way of expressing the traditional teachings. And I'm not going to be talking about the Four Noble Truths or give you a kind of conventional Zen Teisho, slightly different approach. And then show the parallels between that and our collective situation today. Does that make any sense? Does that? So far, so good? But I need your help to begin. What's the most important concept in Buddhism? I think especially obvious in early Buddhism. Anybody?
The end of suffering.
The end of suffering.
Suffering.
Dukkha. Great. The Buddha said all he taught was dukkha and how to end it. You know, dukkha, of course, being the term that's usually translated into English as suffering. But that really only works if we understand it in the broadest possible sense, right? Not just physical, mental pain, dissatisfaction, frustration, anxiety, and my favorite, dis-ease. So with dukkha, the Buddha really seems to be saying it's the nature of our unawakened minds to be bothered by something or to be fundamentally uncomfortable. And that's the question, the big question for us, why? If we go back to the early teachings, the Pali Canon, you know, there are different types of dukkha that's described. Yeah, physical and mental pain, of course. Also dukkha due to impermanence. The fact that, I mean, so often we try to stabilize or control our lives by grasping things, and the idea of impermanence is that it's very difficult to do that because they tend to turn into sand, they tend to transform. And that also applies, of course, to our own impermanence. There's certainly a profound dukkha built into the realization of our own finitude, our own mortality. As the existential psychologists point out, our inability to accept our own mortality is also our inability to live fully right here and now. So again, there's dukkha there. But that's not the one that I want to focus on this morning. It's the dukkha due to the delusion of a separate self. And frankly, if I had to pick out one Buddhist teaching, one Buddhist proposition that to me is the most important, it's the connection that Buddhism makes between dukkha in the broad sense and this illusion of a separate self inside that's somehow separate from the rest of the world outside. Right? In the early teachings, there's some very sophisticated ways of sort of deconstructing the sense of self. You've got the 5 khandhas or skandhas, you've got 12 nidanas and all, and of Paticca Samuppada. But fundamentally, I think there's something very simple here, that built into the concept of a self is that of a non-self. It's like it's inherently dualistic. So I think that when the Buddha's critiquing self, he's fundamentally critiquing this duality, as we said. The sense that there's a me inside, maybe behind the eyes, inside the ears, somewhere I'm in here, and all of you, and the rest of the world is outside. Right? Here I wonder if we can benefit from sort of child psychology, which has learned or substantiated that, of course, babies aren't born with a sense of self, right? A sense of self is something develops as they grow up, as they're socialized. Or we could say in modern language then, the sense of separate self is a psychological and social construct. And linguistic, in the sense that in the process of growing up, we learn language, we learn pronouns, right? I, me, mine. And because of the way language works, language points to things, that's how we sort of separate them and objectify them. So, right, there's a gong and a drum and a cushion and a pad, and there's a me, the analogy that because there's a pronoun and a name for me, then I must be something kind of substantial in the way that those things appear to be. But even more fundamentally, there's a kind of socialization process going on in the sense that our caretaker, maybe our mother, looks into our eyes and says our name. And we learn to see ourselves in the way that other people see us. This is kind of profound, but really important. So the socialization, in order to develop a sense of separate self, we have to grow up into a culture, into a society where other people have this sense of self. It reproduces itself. That's why, for example, the wolf boy of Aveyron in France, the little kid raised by babies, if he's not recovered very quickly, he'll never become fully human. Certain developmental stages are lost, and to be fully human is to be socialized, right? Because this sense of separate or self is necessary in order to function. Or a sense of self anyway. But nonetheless, from a Buddhist point, from a Buddhist perspective, there's something fundamentally problematical about. And I think the way that I've set it up gives us a way to get a kind of a handle on that, right? If the sense of self is a construct, if it doesn't refer to something really self-existing, but it's a way that mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling and acting and reacting and remembering and planning, it's all these mental processes. It's the way these processes work together to support and sustain this sense of separate self. Then there's nothing sort of real or substantial there, right? Which means that this sense of self that we all have is inherently uncomfortable. It's inherently insecure because there's nothing there that could be secured. That there's a kind of dukkha built into what in Zen we talk about our emptiness or kind of the voidness of our core. Because there's a kind of a contradiction. We feel we should be real or we are real, but there's kind of nothing there, right? And this is where it gets really interesting. Thank you for following me through all this so far. Where it gets really interesting, I think, is the way that we usually experience this. I think we normally experience this discomfort as a sense of lack. By lack, I mean the feeling that something is wrong with me. Something is missing, something isn't quite right, or I'm not good enough. Anybody ever feel that? I mean, this I think is one of kind of the great open secrets of life. We all have this feeling in one form or other, but we don't realize everyone else does. We think it's our own individual problem, right? I look at all of you, you know, you look quite real, but inside this thing. So please notice what I'm saying here, that this constructed sense of self is shadowed or haunted by a sense of lack. You could call it a sense of unreality. But the really fascinating thing, I think, is the way that according to how we're conditioned, we understand this in different ways. Usually we're conditioned to think, yeah, okay, there's something missing, we lack something, but it's something out here. Our society conditions us that, yeah, what you need to be doing is trying to get enough of this, and if you get enough of this or enough of that, then it will fill up your sense of lack, your emptiness at the core, and you'll be okay. One obvious example is money, right? I mean, if we grow up in the United States, we learn pretty quickly we don't have enough money or the consumer toys, the consumer things that we can buy with money, right? And it doesn't matter how much money you have, it's not enough. And that's how the lack project works. I call it a lack project because we end up identifying, we have these certain projects. If I just get enough of this or enough of that, then I'll be okay. Then this dukkha will be resolved, right? The problem is the desire for money, as one example, it's just a symptom of the more fundamental issue, right? The emptiness at the core, the lack of self-existence at the core. And therefore, it doesn't matter how much money you get, it'll never be enough to fill up this void. That's the tragedy of the lack project. And it's so sad to see the way that so many people, their whole lives are spent caught up in trying to do something that can never work. I mentioned money. Fame is another one, I think, especially for us today, where we spend so much time looking at screens. Actually coming together and talking together like this is kind of rare. Usually we're relating to each other through screens, whether it's cell phones or iPads or computers or TVs or cinema, right? It's screens. And it's very interesting. On the screens, the same people, the same names and faces keep recurring, right? A-list Hollywood celebrities and politicians. Maybe some of those politicians we don't want to see, but they keep recurring, right? And one of the interesting things, it's like, because they do, it gives them kind of a sense of reality and in contrast, they seem so real because everyone sees them, right? Everyone knows them, everyone talks about them. And in comparison, well, I'm anonymous, I'm nobody. So one way to resolve my sense of lack is try to become famous, yeah? And there's other lack projects. Sometimes I call them reality projects because, again, we don't feel real enough, and somehow if we can just get enough of this, then it'll make us feel more real. Romantic love, although I'm not sure it works the same way for my son's generation as it did for my mother's, but romantic love, the idea that somewhere out there there's this person, right? And if you can just find that perfect person for you, then hey, it's like all the fairy tales end and they lived happily ever after, right? It's going to solve the problem of your life. Well, I think most of us here know it's not so simple, which is not an argument against romance, but it's if you expect your partner to fill up your sense of lack, you're creating an expectation that's just going to cause problems in the relationship, right? And there's other senses of lack. There's other lack projects. Cindy Crawford, supermodel, right? Body, right? If I can just have the perfect body, the woman, the beautiful body, the man, the buff body. It was interesting, I read this interview with Cindy Crawford, and she went on and on. She was really bothered by the fact that she had a little bit of cellulite right here. Here she is, this famous, world model, and it wasn't, just showing that if your perfect body is the way to fill up your sense of lack, it ain't ever going to be perfect enough. All the more so when we realize that we're going to age and get older, right? So these are some examples of lack projects, and we could go on and on. But I think you can get a sense of what I'm talking about here. And one of the interesting things for me, well, two things. First of all, when you talk about lack projects, they do a nice job of connecting our own individual spiritual predicament with the kind of society we live in. So it's not just that maybe you and I are preoccupied with money and consumerism, but we have a whole economic system that's designed to make sure that we are, right? That uses advertising to make us think that the next thing we buy is going to make us happy. It's a predatory system in the sense that it's not really interested in solving our problem. It's simply interested in making money by keeping us on this treadmill, this particular lack project. That's one thing. And the second thing is there's a distorted sense of time that these lack projects build into how we experience our time. The whole point of lack, the whole point of dukkha is that right here and now I have this discomfort. I don't feel good enough or whatever, sense of dukkha right now. So, but I have my lack projects, and in the future I'm going to be okay. So what it means is we're sort of future oriented in a way that isn't really so aware of what's happening right here and now, and in fact tends to devalue the present into just a means to get somewhere else. So this constant future orientation. Yeah. This will be important when I shift to the parallel in a minute. I think Buddhism too is a lack project. And it can actually stay a problematic lack project for some people if we get caught up in this way of thinking about, when I'm enlightened, everything's going to be fine, But it's a lack project that can actually work. That's the wonderful thing about it. If the sense of self is a construct, psychological, social construct, can we understand Zazen as the process whereby it deconstructs? If you think about, if the sense of self is composed of these mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling that I spoke about, the way that they work together and reinforce, when we're meditating, what are we doing? The same sorts of thoughts and feelings arise, but we don't identify with them, we don't link them together, they arise, we let them go. Can we say then that the sense of self is deconstructing? And if the sense of self is deconstructing, what about that sense of lack that goes along with it? You see? The sense of lack is also constructed. They go together, two sides of the coin. I think it was Trungpa who said, enlightenment is always an accident, but meditation makes us accident prone. So, there's not a strict cause-effect between Zazen but nonetheless, we kind of, with Samadhi, we're sort of creating a situation where something can happen, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with Dogen, and especially his most famous phrase about to study the Buddha Dharma is to study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to realize your intimacy with the 10,000 things. Yeah, our path is about forgetting ourselves as a way of overcoming this, or letting go of this duality between ourselves and other people. Dogen himself, of course, after his awakening, he described it by saying, I came to realize clearly that mind is nothing other than rivers and mountains and the great wide earth, the sun and the moon and the stars. So his mind wasn't in here. It wasn't that sense of separation. Actually, my favorite version of that is by the Neo-Vedantin Nisargadatta, who said, when I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life flows. Isn't that great? Yeah. He's got it, wisdom and love, or wisdom and compassion, the two pillars of the Buddhist path. And he also shows the relationship between them, right? The wisdom of realizing non-separation. Love isn't an affect, or it's a way of being in the world that integrates that realization of non-separation. And of course, in the Zen path, we have a special term for this, the Bodhisattva path, right? I mean, as long as we have this sense of lack and sense of separation, there's a sense in which we're kind of self-preoccupied, right? I have this sense of inadequacy. What can I find that's going to solve this problem for me? But once we begin to open up, then the meaning of our life can transform. It's not what's in it for me, what's for my separate benefit, but insofar as we don't feel separate from other people, then the kind of focus is going to be, okay, well, how can I live in a way that's going to work for the well-being of everyone, And we call this the Bodhisattva path. It's not a sacrifice, it's simply integrating this realization that, hey, my well-being isn't separate from yours. End of part one. Does that make sense? Is that okay? Because I now want to try to show you that everything I've just said about our individual predicament also applies to our collective predicament today in relationship to the in relationship to the biosphere. I think it's the same problem. It's one's microcosm, the other macrocosm, but it seems to me the same problem. And one of the important implications of that then is the realization, or putting flesh on what some people say, that the kind of ecological crisis that we face today isn't just technological, economic, political problem. It's fundamentally a spiritual problem as well. As I said, it seems to point to a now global civilization that's lost its way. Right? We not only have individual senses of self, we also have collective senses of self, right? So I'm not just David, I'm a man, not a woman. I'm American, I'm not Chinese. I'm white, I'm not African American. And this refers to certain types of tribalism. We know how this works, how the inside not only feels separate from the outside, but feels better or wants to exploit the outside, right? Patriarchy, racism, nationalism, and so forth, right? But the sense of self that I want to refer to now is our largest collective one, that is to say, our now global civilization, or if you prefer, Homo sapiens sapiens, that we have this sense of separateness from the rest of the earth. And I think, in a way, that's kind of obvious, just by virtue of how we're living, right? It wasn't always that way. Paleontologists tell us for like 98, 99% of our species history, we're hunting-gatherers, right? And it's interesting, if you're a hunting-gatherer, well, you've got to think like your prey, and you also better think like your predator, right? And for gathering, you've got to know what food is available when and where. So there's a kind of embeddedness in the natural world for most of our species history, which is why people say that the greatest event in human history was agriculture some 10 or 11,000 years ago, agriculture and animal husbandry, because suddenly you're in one place and you've got your field, and in effect you need a fence around it because you've got to keep out everything else, right? This sense of separation. But leaping forward a little bit, the sense of separation becomes very strong in terms of how we understand ourselves with classical Greece. And in fact, I think that's one of the reasons that we tend to trace back the modern West to classical Greece. We tend to trace back our democracy, right? They had kind of the first democracy. Not a very good one. Women and slaves needn't apply, but we can ask, why were they able to create a democracy? Because they realized, they discovered something that we today, it's so obvious, we can't see how anyone wouldn't know this. But the reality is, throughout history, most people didn't know this. They realized that there's a big difference between the natural world and human culture, in the sense that if we don't like the way we're living together, we can reorganize it, right? So obvious. That's why we have laws and elections and reform movements, and if those don't work, we can do revolutions, right? We can reorganize our social structure, right? So obvious. And yet, if you go back before the Greeks, if you go back to, and I should say, please bear with me here, you're going to see where I'm going in a minute, but if you go back before the Greeks, if you go back to like early civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the pre-Columbian American, right? Incas, Aztecs, Mayas. It's very interesting. All of those empires, they thought that their social structure, the way they were organized, was natural, just as natural as their ecosystems. They just kind of took it for granted. That's just the way things were. And as an important part of that, they also didn't distinguish between what we today do between sacred and secular. In other words, the guy at the top, and it was usually a guy, right, an emperor or whatever, the guy at the top was not only a kind of a secular ruler, but he was also like a god or a god-like, or the one who communicated with the higher powers, the high priest. It was all kind of embedded, right? They were embedded in the natural world, their religion, they all thought that, well, here's the important point, and here's why I'm emphasizing and taking you on this little tour of world history. All of these societies, pre-Greek, all of these ones that I've mentioned, they all also believed that they had a really important role to play in keeping the cosmos working. And if they didn't play that role, things would fall apart. For example, Mesopotamians believe that we've been created by the gods as their slaves. And if we don't serve them, like sacrifices for food and that, then the gods would get angry. And you don't want the gods to get angry, right? Or the example I'm sure we're all familiar with, right? The Aztecs, this unsavory habit of dragging their war captives up to the top of their step pyramids and cutting out their still beating hearts with an obsidian knife and offering it to the sun god. Why? I mean, that's because they felt that was needed to keep the sun god on his course so he doesn't get lost. They needed to play that function somehow to keep the cosmos working. Now, why am I going into this? If you grow up in that society, by virtue of being born into it, you know what your role is. You have a kind of social security. Your job, you've got a role, not just as a civic member, but it's a religious role that you're supporting the pyramid that's keeping the cosmos working. What about us? All of these societies felt that they were a part of something greater than themselves, and they had a sense of responsibility to it. You know, we may not agree with their particular version. I don't think any of us would want to live in an Aztec society. But just by virtue of being part of that society, there was a kind of a grounding, right? What about us today? Do we feel that we're part of something greater than ourselves? And therefore we have a responsibility to live in a certain kind of way that embodies that responsibility? Well, no. You know, we now more or less think we're accidents of genetic mutation, evolutionary process, and we have no function, no role, no meaning, just we're here. And all we can do is enjoy ourselves, consume. You can see how this plugs into the whole consumerism. All we can do is consume as long as we can, if we can, as much as we can, until we die. Question, is there a kind of dukkha built into this sense of separation? I mean, certainly we can see the dukkha now of how the ecological karma is coming back to us. You know, we're destroying things and we're suffering. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that there's actually a dukkha built into the fact that we feel separate, not just separate, but because we feel separate, because we feel that we're not a part of something greater than ourselves, we have no role to play, and therefore there's no kind of meaning. Does this make any sense? I'm wondering here if anyone has read a book by the Israeli historian Harari. He's become really big lately. His first book called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. Anybody familiar with it? Yeah. Let me just read you the last few sentences of the book. So what he's done is he's talked about, it's a history of our species as he understands it. And so at the end, he basically is saying, okay, where are we at now? Despite the astonishing things that humans are capable of doing, we remain unsure of our goals and we seem to be as discontented as ever. We've advanced from canoes to galleys to steamships to space shuttles, but nobody knows where we're going. We're more powerful than ever before, but have very little idea what to do with all that power. Self-made gods, we are accountable to no one. We're consequently wreaking havoc on our fellow animals and on the surrounding ecosystems, seeking little more than our own comfort and amusement, yet never finding satisfaction. And then his last sentence of the book. Is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want? Right? What, is he on to something here? Is he touching on a kind of fundamental dukkha, maybe built into our sense of separation? If you agree, we're halfway here with the comparison, by the way, right? Not only individually, but collectively, a sense of separation. And it's a constructed sense of separation. And not only that, but there's a dukkha, that there's a profound dissatisfaction built into that. I'm halfway home, if you're with me here. But what about lack project? On the individual level, usually we misunderstand what our fundamental problem is, and we look outside and we think if we just get enough of this or enough of that, then everything will be okay, right? I call them lack projects, reality projects. What about our now global civilization? Do we have a collective lack project? I think we do. I think it's called progress, in the sense of never-ending economic growth and technological development, right? Got to keep growing. Not only do we consumers never consume enough, always wanting more, but think of corporations and the government. Corporations are never profitable enough, their market share is never big enough, their share price is never big enough. And on the national level, every government is preoccupied with GDP. You got to keep growing, got to keep growing. That's the solution to everything, right? But here's my favorite line. Why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? Mm-hmm. And is that the kind of trap that we're caught in today? Naomi Klein puts it really well, where she says we have two systems. On the one hand, we have this economic system that has to keep growing if it's not going to collapse. On the other hand, we have the earth, the biosphere, which basically doesn't grow. And if you have these two systems, sooner or later, they're going to come into, and is that basically now? Is that the ecological crisis? And as she also points out, of those two systems, only one of them can be changed. Right? I think economic growth and development and all that can be really good as a means if you know where you want to go and what's important, what to do. But what I think has happened is because we don't know, as Harari says, the means has become the ends. Just more and more for the sake of itself, more and more and more and more. And when you ask, where's it all going? It's hard to imagine an ending except some kind of collapse eventually, right? So I think we have this lack project. I think that the ideology of the modern world is progress. And I think part of our problem today, too, is that more and more we're losing faith in this story. There's an awful lot of people that are doubting that actually next year is going to be better than this year, or somehow the post-war generation that I'm a part of, we sort of just built into, it's going to get better and better and better, right? My kid's going to have more opportunities, he's going to be wealthier than I am, da-da-da-da. And suddenly that story, which is so much at the heart, kind of rationalizing modernity, now it's collapsing. So again, lack project, not just individually. And also notice the time thing. You remember what I pointed about our individual problems with time, that our lack projects, I'm uncomfortable now, but when I get all the money I need individually, then I'll be okay. The whole progress thing is virtually the same sort of attitude toward time. It's this constant future orientation that takes us away from right here and now, which again is never good enough, right? Okay, if that's true, what's the collective solution? Right? Remember, on the individual level, we have the Buddhist path. What's the equivalent? Return to nature. Another really interesting parallel, just as Buddhism says, there's no, you can't get rid of the self. Why? Because there's never been a separate self. It's just the illusion of a separate self. So it's not about getting rid of something, it's about realizing something. Likewise, we can't return to nature. Why not? Because we've never been apart from it. So. And if you don't believe that, please stop breathing for 4 minutes and see what happens, right? Or stop drinking water for a week and see what happens, right? I mean, so much of our culture is built into denying this. If you think about, so many things we take for granted are all about denying our animal nature, right? Right? So the bathroom, you sit on the loo, you're going to close the door, right? It's likewise when you have sex with somebody, you don't do it in the street for the most part, right? It's all, this is sort of connecting with our animality, and we don't,
But we do eat together.
We do eat, good, but also very important that we have all these rituals to make sure that we do it in a certain way. Yeah. Eating together is so much fun. That would be a shame to give that up. Right, yeah. It's true. We know historically 98-99% of our DNA is similar to our two closest relatives, the chimpanzees and the bonobos, right? We still think of ourselves as sort of we still think of the environment as a place where we happen to be living. We don't realize that, it's more than a home. It's like the earth is more than our home. It's our mother, or it's our parent. And we never cut the umbilical cord. If you think about it, that's, the air, the water, we're part of this grand circulation, which makes me wonder just how successful it's going to be to terraform Mars, I have to say, it just feels like a fantasy to me, okay, we've screwed up this planet, well, let's go to Mars and do it there too, right? What does it really mean to feel that we're non-dual, non-separate, one with the natural world? There's this old problem in Buddhism, I'm sure you've come across it, or most of you at one time. If there's no real self, who or what is it that becomes awakened, that becomes enlightened? Right? And I wonder if the Buddha himself actually answered that very soon after his awakening when he was challenged by Mara. People remember this? Right? So Mara comes up and says, who do you think you are? You think you're awakened? Well, prove it. Who verifies, who authorizes this? And what did the Buddha do? Anybody?
The earth is my witness.
So, the earth is my witness. So powerful. But what does that really mean? If you think about it. The earth is my witness. What is that saying? Can we say that the human species is a way that the earth becomes self-aware? I mean, we're just one of the many millions of species is enlightenment, is awakening the earth waking up? If so, it would seem to imply a lot of, well, not only connectedness, but a sense of responsibility, right, to that which we are a part of. But let me finish the parallels with this question of collective enlightenment, right? And that seems like it's a bit of a challenge, right? Thich Nhat Hanh said, "The Buddha attained individual awakening. Today we need a collective enlightenment to stop the course of destruction." What does that really mean? I mean, in a way we nod, but what? I mean, it's like, are we going to convert everyone to Buddhism and we're all going to start meditating and we're all going to have Kensho or something? Well, if so, it's going to be a long time coming. Probably too slow for the kind of situation that we find ourselves in, right? But are we maybe looking in the wrong place? Anybody here read Paul Hawken's book, Blessed Unrest? Paul Hawken, interestingly, is a Zen student, San Francisco Zen Center. Also an international lecturer, you know, he'd go around giving talks. I think it was how corporations can clean themselves up, green themselves. But he would then collect all these business cards, and one day he had a big pile. He started counting them and doing some research online, and he realized that something is happening now that's never happened before in human history. That there's a very large number of groups of people, mostly small. He originally estimated in his book between 1 million and 1.5 million, but I think on his YouTube it's well over 2 million now. Very large number of groups of people that are springing up to work for social justice, sustainability, and the healing of the earth. You know, naturally, almost all of them like non-profits. They're people just wanting to do this. And again, he emphasizes this has never happened before. And you can notice that people doing this aren't doing it for like, people doing this aren't doing it for their own individual benefit for the most part. They're doing it to make things better generally, right? And to me, the most fascinating part of this book was that he had a chapter comparing this phenomenon with the immune system of our bodies. And he said, this is the immune system of the earth springing up to work for its healing. Wow. Can we understand groups like Extinction Rebellion, which has just kind of exploded in the last year or so, right? It really does feel that there's been some real shift of consciousness that this had to happen. And Greta, it's like, what's going on here? Certainly these are parts of that immune system, I think. Well, I think that they're parts of this immune system that Hawken refers to. This immune system of, you know, I mean, Greta's not doing it out of selfish reasons, right? And the people who are doing Friday school strikes and the people that are engaged in Extinction Rebellion actions, they're doing it because we feel our back is against the wall and that we know it's become quite clear we can't depend on governments because they're too corrupted, right? So trying to find ways to hold authorities' feet to the fire. Right? He did emphasize, however, that Paul Hawken
It's noon.
He did emphasize that these immune systems can fail, you know, and we know this from HIV. I mean, immune systems can be destroyed, and that's exactly what's possible. So, you know, Hawken doesn't say that it's definitely going to happen. He said that it's in fact a possibility. So there's no guarantee. Same, by the way, with the Shambhala warrior prophecy. In a time of great darkness, the Shambhala warriors will arise. And, but it doesn't say how the prophecy is going to end. It doesn't say if they're going to be victorious or not. So I've brought you a long ways, or tried to, right? In both cases, on the individual level and on the collective level, sense of separation, which is constructed, and there's a dukkha built into it. And there's also lack projects involved where we actually misunderstand what the real issue is and we act in ways that make things worse. But there are ways to try to address that, both individually and collectively. And you could say that it seems to me we're all called upon to become part of the immune system of the earth. Now, I'm aware of the time, but I just want to spend a couple minutes to ask the question, okay, if we have all of these organizations springing up, such as are needed, is there a distinctive role for Buddhism? And I think there is, because the Bodhisattva path emphasizes two sides, two aspects. It's like Bodhisattvas continue to work on their own personal transformation, but they also know that that's not enough. That it's not enough to sort of simply sit in our cushions. We've got to bring whatever equanimity, emptiness, awakening, whatever, to our engagement with the world. And I think a lot of the problem for us is that historically we have thought practice is simply what's going on in our cushions and anything else is a distraction from that. And the transition that we're in the process of making is the realization that our action, our engagement in the world is just as much a part of our practice, whereby we actually integrate whatever we realize into how we actually live in the world and relate to other people. Bob Thurman was famous for, he used to say, practice, practice, practice. Everyone's talking about practice. What I want to know is, when is the performance? Now, right? With our engagement, right? Now, there are a lot of things to say about this. I mean, the point of the double activity is the realization that Buddhism emphasizes that it's not enough just to work for social transformation. It's really important that that be linked to our personal, individual transformation, such as goes on in our zazen, in our individual practice, right? I think that is a really crucial thing that Buddhism maybe emphasizes more than anything else that I know. And as part of that linkage, what I want to conclude with is one aspect of the Bodhisattva path that stands out for me that is only possible, I think, because we are grounded in our own contemplative practices. And it's this, that bodhisattvas act without attachment to the result of what they do. And that's really, really important. It's also really, really easy to misunderstand because, from the beginning, Buddhism emphasizes motivation and intention so much, and you might think, well, that's all that's important. If my intention's pure, it doesn't matter if it has an effect or not. And I think that totally misses the point here. We need to be as strategic as possible. We need to think as clearly as we can what might be effective. Acknowledging the larger don't know mind, right? That we really don't know what's possible, that we don't know what's coming down, we don't know how it will affect. I'm reminded of Bob Aiken, one of my teachers, who said, our path isn't about clearing up the mystery, it's making the mystery clear. So in the process of our practice, we open up. And it's not as though, oh, now I understand no, it's this fantastic mystery where we don't know. We don't grasp this mystery, we open up to it. It takes us, right? So what does this mean in terms of our bodhisattva activity? Simply this, that our task today as bodhisattvas and ecosattvas, and I think we're all at this point being called to this, our task is to do the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do makes any difference whatsoever. Because we can't know that. That's what it really comes down to, I think. We do not know if what we do is important, but it's important for us to do it. And it's not about, therefore, it's not about, in the face of the mystery, it's not about optimism, pessimism, hope, despair, these dualities. My favorite definition of a pessimist is somebody who has had to live with an optimist. You can see how, and also that way of thinking, it takes off some of the pressure or some of the intensity of now, right? Optimist, things are going to get better. Pessimism, why bother? It's like, in a way, it can detract from the need to do what we need to do right now. As I said before, responding appropriately right here and now. And the same thing with hope and despair. That they can be kind of future-oriented in a way that detracts from the real responsibility without knowing. And that's okay. That's okay. Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic, I'm going to close with 3 very short quotations. Havel said about hope. Thank you. Hope isn't the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, something is worth doing, regardless of how it turns out. Yeah? And Wendell Berry, I'm sure there's some other Wendell Berry fans here. We don't have the right to ask whether we're going to succeed or not. The only question we have the right to ask is, what's the right thing to do? What does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live on it? And finally, any other Lord of the Rings fans here? I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that's not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. A friend reminded me actually that Joanna Macy says in a way just the opposite. What a wonderful time to be alive. To be challenged and to do the very best we can in this situation. And she says, I wouldn't want to miss it for the world. Maybe they're both right. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.